Munchkins. Munchkins! Oh, they ruin role-playing! And of course they do, because the term is a slur and you can throw it around at anybody you want. Now, what is a Munchkin? You've probably heard the term before. I actually don't see it thrown around that much anymore. But when I was young, the way it was explained to me is a Munchkin is someone who still has kind of a juvenile take on the whole role-playing theory. They think that role-playing is about kicking down the door, killing the monsters, stealing the treasure, so that you can kick down a bigger door, kill a bigger monster, and steal a bigger treasure. In fact, there's a card game called Munchkin, and that's the entire premise of the card game, so I think that used to be a fairly common perspective on what Munchkin meant. However, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't that just D&D? And for a lot of people, that is exactly what D&D is. That's all that role-playing is. So those people don't like to be called Munchkins. They don't really like the slur to be thrown around. And ultimately, the big problem with thinking about what is a Munchkin and why is it, what's good about it, what's bad about it, is it's important to think about how this kind of discussion can be productive. And that's difficult because we're discussing a slur. I can put it this way, though. Being a Munchkin means that you play every role-playing game, kind of like Skyrim. You start the game up, and everything is pretty much exactly the same, except for your character build. And it's funny because Munchkins, they'll often talk about how they've got system mastery in whatever their favorite system is, which is almost always D&D. And it's especially amusing when you look at like 5th edition D&D, which is supposed to be super foolproof. It doesn't really let you make that many decisions. Everything kind of comes to you in discrete level units, and all the monsters are supposed to be able to be defeated. You walk through that door, and you can safely assume the GM is supposed to make them killable. Now, some people don't, and some people cling to the old ways and say that games should be fatal or whatever, but now I feel like it's a huge faux pas to introduce enemies that could surprise or destroy the party. I mean, they just walk through the door and they fight the enemies. So system mastery, a lot of times when it comes to Munchkins, it really kind of doesn't change much about the way the Munchkin approaches the game. Usually they're just focused on killing the next thing or achieving the next objective. This is true even outside of D&D. I played with Munchkins, and I had them in the hero system, which is a universal point-buy system. You describe it, you can build it. And what those guys would do is they would just describe a character build, and then build that, and then try to go from room to room and kill monsters. It was the same every time. Now you may be thinking, what is wrong with that? They're achieving the objective of the game. They're winning the battles. They're getting to the end of your story, whatever that may be. You as the GM must have something planned, and they're proceeding through your plans. Why are you complaining? In fact, in my opinion, the real Munchkins are the guys who use their characters as excuses to make chaos and not actually follow through on the game. Those are the Munchkins. Those are the juvenile ones. They're the ones who are doing it wrong. And to this I say there are different types of Munchkins. And actually, the Munchkin stuff kind of stems from behaviors that can be good with some modification. So, for example, the chaotic guy who's causing a lot of destruction, if you can direct that a little bit, then creating a lot of chaos for your enemies and making your own motives confusing and opaque to your enemies can make you harder to track in a dynamic sandbox type of game. So it's actually not bad necessarily to have players who enjoy creating chaos and setting things on fire. You just need to be able to channel that productively. In fact, I actually have less of a problem with chaotic players because at least that feels like a dialogue. Player A does something chaotic and destructive, and then the GM says, okay, well, how would the world react to this? The Munchkin setup, however, where you try to achieve an objective and you've just got your blinders on to everything but that objective, that's hard to work with if you want to tell an interactive story because it becomes the GM telling you what's going on and what's going to happen, and then the objective players just move towards that objective, and there's really no humanity, there are no characters, there's really nothing to it, it just becomes dice and numbers. And while to some people it may seem like the mechanical things and the story things are somehow antithetical, they're really not. You can make a very mechanically effective character and still do tons of story stuff, and I'll explain it this way. Let's consider Ash Ketchum and Naruto. These are both stories that are very dumb, but fun, which is kind of what role-playing is. I mean, come on, almost every role-playing game is kind of pulpy. So, what these two characters have in common is an objective. They want to be the very best. Naruto wants to be the Hokage, Ash Ketchum wants to be the Pokemon Master, the best. But I think it's safe to say that nobody would argue that these two characters are identical in nature. They have very different personalities. Now, when a Munchkin makes a role-playing character, a lot of times you'll tell them, well, create a motive. Think about what your character is trying to achieve, and then that should be what drives you forward. And they'll say, I want to be the best. I want to be the strongest. It's probably the most common motive that I hear. I'm going to be the best fighter. I'm going to be the best monk. I'm going to be the best luchador. Whatever. They're just going to be the best. And of course, how it plays out is that best means I get to level 20 and then the game ends. It sounds like a safe motive. It's really open. It just means I advance through the levels. You know, what could be wrong with that? How could it possibly clash with the game? But here's the thing. It's just a stated objective. It doesn't really mean anything. A stated objective is not actually a motive. Like if you were a writer or an actor or something creative, that is not your motive. Being the best is not a motive. I have to be incredibly clear about this. A stated physical objective that you can underline and achieve numerically, it is not your motive. Oh, I know. Naruto says he's gonna be the greatest ninja. He's gonna be the Hokage. It is practically his catchphrase, but it is not his motive. Because your motive is why you do something. Why does Naruto want to be the Hokage? Because he is fanatically insecure, and everyone thinks he's an idiot, and he wants to prove that he's not the dumb guy that everybody treats him like. That's Naruto's motive. That is what makes him an actually interesting character. That is why people watch his show and read his manga. It's not because he's going to do a job, or get money, or achieve the best. It's because he's insecure and you kind of relate to him. You're like, oh yeah, I feel insecure sometimes too. Go get him, Naruto! Prove you're not as dumb as they say you are! And what's kind of beautiful about that is that you could pluck Naruto out of that ninja thing and put him into any other setting, and you could kind of imagine how he'd behave and how that would look. Like if you put him into Warhammer 40k, he might be trying to become a space marine, he might try to be the chapter master, but depending on how the game is playing out, he might also turn to chaos worship, because that's a path to respect and power. Maybe Zinch will give me some abilities, and then everyone will stop looking down on me. You can tailor that insecurity to kind of the theme and the objective of the game. Like, Naruto's story kind of ends when he becomes the Hokage, but it didn't have to. Naruto still being insecure while he's the Hokage could create more conflict and more story if the author really wanted. Then Ash Ketchum, on the other hand, also wants to be the very best, but that doesn't really stem from personal insecurity. I mean, he gets humiliated lots of times, but I feel like what Ash is really doing is trying to live up to social expectations. And as the Pokemon series goes on, he's trying to live up to the expectations of his friends and his Pokemon because he really values that. Totally different motive, totally different set of emotions, but you can also imagine how you might pick Ash up and put him into a different setting, and how that would still be the same compassionate and concerned character that you followed throughout Pokemon. In a nutshell, Naruto's all about, am I good enough for me? And Ash is all about, am I good enough for Pikachu? Both these characters are trying to be the peak of society in their respective universes, but for different reasons and for different motives. The stated objective is not the motive. The feelings, the reason why the character does this stuff, that's the character motive. So to go back around and tie this together, you can have a character that's mechanically powerful. That's fine. It's actually not essential to be powerful or weak or anything else. The important thing is just that you have this core emotional motive that kind of describes how your character is going to behave. If the character's insecure, they're going to be doing things to try to reduce their own insecurity because they don't like that feeling. That's their drive. If the character's really concerned about everyone else's feelings, then they're going to be trying to maintain everyone else's respect and doing what they think will get them the most respect. That's another type of emotional motive that will drive your character. And again, it doesn't get in the way of your mechanics. You can do both. You can be mechanically good and also narratively good. What this is not compatible with that the Munchkin gets confused about is metaplay. So if you, as the player, know that something would be good for your character, you can't necessarily go do it if you know that it would conflict with your character's emotional motive. And I think this is why Munchkins believe that narrative players are like worse players. Right, like let's suppose that you're Ash Ketchum and you hear that a Pokemon has gotten trapped in a cave-in. Well, you as the player might understand that cave-ins are unsafe, and you would say, well, we better not mess with that. I don't want to be trapped in a cave-in. But Ash Ketchum would absolutely go in that cave and he would try to rescue that Pokemon. I mean, He values their opinion of him. This is the contract that Ash is following. His motive says go. Meta, be damned. What you know outside of the script, be damned. Ash has these feelings, he's going to carry them out. The thing that's happening there is that Ash, as a character, is pursuing a different type of reward than what the Munchkin player is going after. So the Munchkin player wants to mechanically succeed. The Munchkin wants a bigger sword and to do more damage and to beat the game, Whereas Ash Ketchum wants to be respected and loved by Pokemon, right? Ash values something differently than a Munchkin would value. So that's kind of where you get the conflict from. It's not that narrative and Munchkin play are exclusive necessarily. It's just that, Ash is not going to be a Munchkin. He will do and always does things that are obviously stupid if it satisfies that particular reward center in his brain that tells him this is good to me. So anyway, this is what I say, but I feel that in practice what tends to happen is that groups will segregate out, and you'll get Munchkin players will eventually find one another and they'll create Munchkin groups. And if anyone comes in and they try to play an emotional motive and they say well, my character would go into that burning building, they eventually will beat that out of that player because they'd be like, that's mechanically disadvantageous. And the other player learns to just play the game and roll the dice and not really think about what a character would do. Whereas with a more narrative group, you have no way of knowing what the players are going to do. It depends on what they decided their motives were. So they might all panic and fly in different directions. Maybe one guy jumps straight in. Another guy, goes to find the police. They follow the reward paths for their character rather than trying to come up with the most mechanically victorious way to play. Now, there are pros and cons to both ways to play. The Munchkin group, for example, always knows exactly what's going to happen. Usually they will succeed at whatever it is they're trying to do, and they will have no character deaths. So that's kind of the upside of that. The downside of that is the exact same thing. You always sort of know exactly what they're going to do. There's almost no point in playing the game. I mean, you're gonna succeed. You're kind of just trying to see what the GM will do, and you put everything on the GM to make them play the game for you, basically. Ironically, the other part of that is that although you have no character deaths and you succeed, the success and the characters don't really matter. I mean, yes, nobody dies, but also everybody is interchangeable. They're all just trying to mechanically achieve victory. So if a character died, you would just replace them with another build that doesn't really matter. Who cares? Who cares? Who cares if you succeed? In fact, I know a whole campaign that was based on a living setting, where a group of Munchkins went ahead and just succeeded at everything. They put the king back on the throne, and they established a state religion based on their own religion, which was Cthulhu worship, by the way. But at the end of it all, when you looked at everything they'd done, nothing that they did really mattered. All that mattered was the stuff that the GM kind of did for them. So the king coming back, that was important. And some of the stuff the GM established for them, that remained. But no one really looked at the religion, because if they did, the entire setting would have flown apart, because come on, it's Cthulhu worship. They got the Cthulhu worship thing because they rolled some dice and wanted Cthulhu to be worshipped, because their character worshipped Cthulhu. What does that mean? They didn't think about it. Munchkins! At the end of that campaign, no one in the country could really describe who these people were, or why they did what they did, or why the entire nation was now worshipping Cthulhu as a state religion. No one even, they didn't have any holidays. They didn't think about it. It never came up because Munchkins. Munchkin roll dice. He requests new state religion. Munchkin roll 20. Now Munchkin have new state religion. So it felt like, on paper, it appeared that these characters had achieved a lot, but as soon as I started asking questions of well, what did the priests of Pelor say when they changed over to this worship? What did anyone feel? What was anybody thinking? It had never been asked before. And that's the advantage of a more narrative approach, is that when you think about the feelings and the people and the backstory and everything else, you know where you're going with it and why you're going with it and what are the reward centers that people are chasing on a practical level. I mean, you would describe the sermons and the things that roused the public and really made them want to embrace this new religion, in spite of the fact that, in the end, it's going to destroy their country because it's Cthulhu worship. So, that's the pitfall to the Munchkin approach. They achieve everything, they usually succeed, but none of their success is meaningful. It's not really a story. You don't really care that it happened, and it didn't happen to anybody. To which most Munchkin players will say, Who cares? It's a game, and it's all fictional, and none of these things are real, and I don't care. It doesn't matter. But the advantage of the narrative approach is that at the end, you do have a story, and to anyone who wants to hear your incredibly nerdy rambling, it's fun. But not only that, because you're not trying to achieve optimal results, more often the games move faster because you know what you want. And you're acting towards getting what you emotionally want rather than what you objectively want. It's easier to know how your character feels than it is to calculate every possible angle, especially when you don't have all the information. For example, it's really hard to do a sandbox Munchkin game because, you're at this mine, and there could be a Balrog inside that mine, but you don't know for sure. You heard some rumors. You could go around, and it would take you 3 months of traveling through a swamp. That would be really bad. But, you got a ranger in the party, so maybe you could just fast forward. The GM won't make you roleplay it. There's all this debate, and you're not really sure if you're skipping out stuff that the GM planned. Whereas with the narrative stuff, you just say you know what, there's probably no Balrog in here, and you go in there because you act on your feelings and your impulses rather than on meta logic. With a proper narrative group, the action doesn't really stop or slow down, or at least you try not to have it. I used to play with a Munchkin group. We would play for 8 hours, and we would cross a river. And at the end of the day, that could be all that we said. We had all this discussion and all this debate. We crossed a river, and we did it optimally. We successfully, objectively crossed the river. Whereas with my more narrative games, I can play for 3 hours and can topple an entire nation just because things keep moving and people are doing stuff. And I don't have to sit and listen to them quibble about theoretical things they don't really have information on. They just follow their feelings, they kill the king, they move on. So, to Munchkin or not to Munchkin? I mean, it really depends on the motive that drives you. Some guys, I think, they like to do the Munchkin thing because they fear loss, and they really don't want to lose, and they feel invested in their characters, and the fact that they're there at all, that's socializing with friends, and that's what they really care about. So it doesn't really matter to them how the game actually plays out, or if it's really slow or whatever. If you spend 8 hours a day with a group of guys, those guys are your friends. The narrative group, on the other hand, might be trying to tell a story, or, tell jokes or other things like that. They've got kind of a different motive. They're also in it for social reasons, but, the characters, I could make a new one. This one is funny and interesting, but I bet I have a bunch of other funny, interesting ideas. There's less fear of loss, and you move a lot faster, make quicker decisions. Ironically, you cope with mistakes better. So I firmly advocate to try to avoid munchkining, but some people will say that there's really no other way to roleplay. It's up to you, but me personally, I would rather die in a fire than sit for another 8 hours listening to people talk about whether or not we can build a bridge.